Hello, welcome to lecture number 7. Today we're going to talk about cellular respiration, and we're going to do an overview of the topic. You're going to get into the details next week when you read the rest of the chapter, but for today we're going to talk about what it is, where it happens, and what goes on in the big picture. So I'm going to draw it out. I think that drawing is a really great way to learn this subject, so I really hope that you draw it as well as I'm drawing it. It'll be a good way to get it to stick in your brain. So get a pen and a piece of paper and let's doodle. Okay, so the first thing you read about when you did your reading this week was a molecule called ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate. I want to talk about what this thing is because it's pretty cool. Adenosine triphosphate is an adenosine, and it's attached to a sugar. It's a ribose sugar, which is shaped like a hexagon. And then that sugar is attached to 3 phosphates in a row. So adenosine tri-3-phosphate. So there's really cool things about this molecule. 1, I love that it has a sugar in it, that's just fun. And 2, this molecule has a weird bond right here between the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate. This bond here is unstable, but it has a ton of energy stored in that bond right there. So when we use ATP for cellular energy, we're going to use it from that bond. And what happens is this: your adenosine triphosphate is sitting there. Oops, that's supposed to be a hexagon. And all of a sudden, your body does something, and it pops that 3rd phosphate off. And when it pops that 3rd phosphate off, it's just this little explosion, this little pow of energy. Energy is just released like crazy right here. And that energy can be used to do work. In your cell, that might mean you could use it to do exocytosis or endocytosis or move something big across your cell membrane, all the stuff that you learned earlier. So pop, you take your phosphate, you pop it off the end, you're left with adenosine diphosphate. There's now 2, and you've got this other little phosphate here that's now all sad and lonely because it's no longer attached to ATP because ATP doesn't exist anymore. You now have adenosine diphosphate and a random phosphate sitting over there alone. So that's how you use the energy in ATP. You break this bond, you release it, and you do work with it. Which is cool, but like, what about my sad little phosphate just hanging out alone? And luckily for this phosphate, it can easily reattach. That can just pop right back on. There's a special molecule that does this. It's called ATP synthase. And you know a couple things about it already. It ends in ase, so it has to be an enzyme. And to synthesize something means to make it. So ATP synthase is an enzyme that makes ATP. And it takes that phosphate, it shoves it right back on, and you are left with adenosine triphosphate all over again. Which is cool because this bond still has a lot of energy in it, and you could just pop it off and use that energy, do some cellular work, and then pop it right back on, and then pop it off and pop it on. And so ATP is renewable, it's reusable, it's recyclable, which is really neat. So you need a ton of ATP to function, and the way that your body makes most of your ATP is in a process called aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic, which implies that oxygen's being involved. Cellular happens in your cell, and respiration. In our world, that means that you're going to be making energy. So here's my beautiful big cell. Here's my nucleus. And then you have thousands of mitochondria inside of a cell. They would be like that big. I'm going to draw it huge so we can talk about what's happening inside of it. They kind of look like jelly beans. So draw yourself a jelly bean. And then they have two membranes. The inner membrane is all wiggly. So wiggle up your membrane here. The reason that the inner membrane is wiggly like this is because it increases the surface area. The surface area of this inner membrane is going to be important in this process. The inside of the inner membrane is called the matrix, like that awesome 90s movie. Then you have the outer membrane, the inner membrane, and then in between here, this space between the two is the intermembrane space. So there's our vocab. Now what's going to happen is you're going to use sugar and you're going to make ATP energy. That's what happens in cellular respiration. Gets converted to ATP. There are 4 main steps. Some books, including ours, describe it as 3 steps. I like to keep all the steps separate, so I say there's 4. Either way you learn it, totally fine as long as you understand the process. The first step happens in the cytoplasm, and it's called glycolysis, which I always have to say glycolysis in my head to spell it right. Now, glycolysis is cool because it tells us what happens already just in this word. Glyco means sugar, and lysis means to break. So in glycolysis, you're going to take sugar, which is glucose, and you're going to break it into 2 new molecules. These molecules are called pyruvate. Rad. Why did you do that? The answer is sugar, all sorts of cool energy in there, right? But it's too big for us to use. We have to break it into smaller bits. So pyruvate, it's small enough that it can go inside of your mitochondria, which is where step number 2 happens. Step number 2 is called pyruvate oxidation. Pyruvate oxidation. So oxidation is going to be the loss of electrons. Now, pyruvate oxidation occurs in the intermembrane space, and what happens is you take your pyruvate and you turn it into another molecule that's called acetyl, and then CoA, which stands for coenzyme A. Acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is going to be used in the 3rd step. The 3rd step is called the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle. In the citric acid cycle, you're going to take your acetyl-CoA and you're going to turn it into a bunch of electrons, which is amazing, right? Those electrons, yet they have a negative charge. You remember that from the beginning of class. You're going to use those in the last step, the 4th step. Which is called oxidative phosphorylation. Left out an R. Oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation is going to take those electrons, I'm going to abbreviate it now, electrons with a little negative because they're negative charged, to make ATP. This is the process. What happens is, in the inner membrane of your mitochondria, you've got a series of proteins. I'm going to draw them just as little rectangles. These proteins are called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain. transport chain, these molecules here are going to take electrons that we made earlier in the process. They're going to fall through, and you're going to pump hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space where they don't like to be crowded. So you're going to end up with a bunch of protons here. Protons are written just as hydrogens because hydrogens have one proton. So if you see an H like this, it means it's a proton. All these little hydrogens, these little protons here, are super crowded. The concentration gradient is high, and the only way they can get out is through a molecule called ATP synthase that we talked about earlier. ATP synthase allows the hydrogen to go back into the matrix, and as it does, it takes a DP and a phosphate and it shoves them together and it makes ATP. So that was our ultimate goal, is to make ATP. Most of the ATP made in this process is during the last step, oxidative phosphorylation, but you also make ATP just a little bit in glycolysis, and you make a little bit in the citric acid cycle, which is super cool, but the bulk of it really is in step 4. That's where you make a bunch of your ATP. Now there's something that we didn't add to this at all, and that is oxygen. Here's oxygen gas. And we never talked about what it is or why it's used or how come you need to breathe. And I'm leaving it as a mystery because I think this is one of the coolest parts. Like, we know that you need oxygen to survive. You can hold your breath or not breathe for about 3 minutes or so before you get brain damage. If you go 5 minutes, you die. And so the reason that you need to breathe while you need this oxygen is because of something that happens during the electron transport chain. So that's super exciting. There's a mystery for you to learn about next week when you read the rest of this chapter. And there's another thing to be aware of, and that's electrons. We're going to go more into detail about what these electrons are and how they're used. We're actually going to harvest some electrons in glycolysis, and we're going to harvest some in pyruvate oxidation, and we're going to definitely get some in our citric acid cycle. And then these places, these 3 steps, are where we're going to get the electrons that we use during oxidative phosphorylation. So, very exciting. General overview is you have your molecule ATP. Whenever you use it, you convert it into ADP and a phosphate. And you need to get these back together. You get these back together in your mitochondria using a process called oxidative phosphorylation, and that requires 3 steps before it can occur. So this whole series of events is just to get your ATP back and functioning. Okay, I know that was a whole lot, but if you can get the general scheme, like the general flow of events, next week when you add more details, you'll be able to file it in your brain better. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, which I hope you do, please email me, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.